So, and I think, this is definitely another area I want to, get into the debates for a couple of minutes. I think, obviously you got to give Bernie Sanders a lot of credit out of 2016. He pivoted really hard onto foreign policy to the point where he's been the only Democrat member of the Democratic caucus in the Senate in 2017 to vote against Iran sanctions, which was a significant part of ratcheting things up in this crisis. And then, of course, all of his work on Yemen, which is huge. And, of course, the Trump administration is just grotesque in that regard. We're heading into the debates. You've got these two different nights. It's kind of awkward. I think it's pretty hilarious that Marianne Williamson is there and the governor of Montana isn't. And I like that. I'm totally not mad at it because I don't need to hear from him. I mean, what is your kind of general, what are you expecting from these debates? What do you think? What would you like to see? What would you not like to see?
Well, I always like to see specific questions and, more importantly, specific answers in regard to policy proposals. And luckily, we do have a number of candidates who have come out with policy proposals ahead of time, and I'm looking forward to that. What I'm hoping is that it becomes abundantly clear to Americans that there are some candidates who are all about political expediency. There are some candidates who might talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. And it's just substance. I want to see substance. I want to see real detailed solutions for the issues that we're facing today. And so I think this is my prediction. I think Buttigieg is going to suffer a little bit from these debates because, he's this guy who believes on running based on values as opposed to detailed policy positions. Which is ridiculous. And so I'm really curious to see, how he does up against some of the candidates who have come out with more detailed policy proposals. I hate the way that the debates are set up in terms of the number of hosts that'll be involved. I feel like that's just a giant ego trip that people are having. And I'm hoping that it doesn't distract from the actual substance from the debates. But honestly, I don't want to predict too much. I just kind of want to be open-minded and just open-minded to these candidates. With that said, though, it's getting harder and harder for me to not just outright endorse Bernie Sanders. I want to be fair, right? I want to hear them out. But even before the debates, there have been policies rolled out. There have been votes. There are records we can look at. And there's one person who's been consistent for decades, and that's Bernie Sanders. So
yeah, without a doubt.
So I'm still trying to be fair, but at the same time, look, the mainstream media is not helping because the more they attack him, the more I want to rally, to his side and defend him because the attacks are just so ludicrous. And while they attack him with all these ridiculous smears, they simultaneously make excuses for Biden and his willingness to work with some of the most disgusting people on the planet.
Well, that's the dynamic. And I do want to do this specific debunk with you because this one that's coming out today about, this comments about Elizabeth Warren and then the Vanity Fair headline is the quintessential, there's a lot of people in the Democratic Party and obviously amongst the corporate and Democratic elites, it makes sense in a material sense why they have a hatred and a fixation of Bernie Sanders. But then there's also just a lot of people, who sort of bought into this, almost this giant apparatus basically still running the 2016 campaign against him. And I think you have this weird dynamic. And, look, obviously I endorse Sanders. I'm 100% with him. But I think, you have this interesting thing where Biden, they'll make excuses and spin for Biden, even as, even today it drops in the Washington Post. It isn't just that Biden keeps using this example of Senator Eastland, who was one of the most despicable people to serve in the Senate. It's that the reason they had a friendly relationship in the 70s, among other things, is that, and I quote, this is Joe Biden writing to Senator Eastland in June 30th, 1977. I just read this a couple minutes before we went on air. I want you to know that I very much appreciate your help during this week's committee meeting in an attempt to bring my anti-busing legislation to a vote. So they built, even setting aside what Biden is dismissing in terms of like just being clear about who this arch segregationist bigot was, and the fact that he weirdly keeps using him as an example of civility or whatever other nonsense he's putting forward. No, they did work together in the 70s, and they worked together because Joe Biden was playing on Northeast resentments and racism against progress with race legislation. And, some of the same people are going to minimize that, are going to say, that, I don't know, Bernie Sanders phrased an answer incorrectly on something in 2014. So his whole, his record of civil rights completely erased. And then I think in the middle, regardless of what you think of Warren, and obviously Warren, of course, is a good candidate in many ways. I'm having more critiques of her recently, but like she's getting a total pass. So you have this like weird thing where Biden is spun for, even though he's just completely irredeemable. Warren is getting a total free ride. And then with Bernie, it's just constant.
Well, let's keep it real. I mean, and this is my speculation, but I think that there's evidence to back this a little bit. So I think that the establishment is purposely propping Elizabeth Warren up and also giving her the passes that you just mentioned. I think that they are doing this to drive a wedge between progressives. And, if it ends up being against Biden and Warren, do you think that the establishment is going to continue giving Warren a pass? No, they're trying to divvy up the progressive vote. They're trying to do away with Bernie, and they want to make this race between Warren and Biden so they can effectively, destroy Warren's chances later on. That's the way that I see this. Because the fact of the matter is you have, examples of op-eds written by Third Way, a corporate-backed so-called Democratic think tank, right, that said things like, oh, Elizabeth Warren would be absolutely disastrous with her populist policies. That was just in 2013, not too long ago. And now all of a sudden you're seeing them prop her up. Do you think that they changed their minds? Do you think the corporations and the bankers that fund them and their stupid think tank genuinely changed their minds and now think that Warren is going to be a great candidate? No, they want to drive that wedge. And for me, it's incredibly transparent.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that Warren is a terrible candidate. I think that she has some policies that are fantastic. My favorite policy is what she wants to do when it comes to student loan debt. But with that said, if you compare Bernie and Warren, Bernie has some significant strengths that Warren lacks.
I agree with that completely. And everything you said, including the fact that, of course, they'll shiv her, when given the opportunity. But I do think it's, in the beginning of the campaign, you would read profiles and the Wall Street people would say anybody besides Sanders or Warren. Now they're saying, and the true hatred is on Sanders. And I think it's because even though of course, they don't like Warren, and of course it's disingenuous because she does have genuine bona fides on Wall Street and finance, which are super important. The systemic nature of what Bernie is offering, they understand there is not a place for them in it, even down to like people who are just like failed Democratic consultants. And so you will see a complete war on him and just this relentless disingenuousness. And we'll just do this one quick debunk because this is just incredible, right? Like we're already at the phase where, Bernie says the sky is blue and like that's proof that he's a secret reactionary. Like it didn't take that long for this level of BS about him. So Bernie said in a conversation, I don't actually know the original source, but this is tweeted by Marissa Barrara on Twitter. And Bernie said, I think there are a certain number of people who'd like to see a woman president and a woman elected. And I understand that, which, okay, empathetic, objectively true. Then he added, Elizabeth's a friend of mine, and I think she's running a good campaign, right? So this is like, okay, so first we have him making an objectively correct statement and then a courteous comment about Senator Warren. Vanity Fair headlines, Sanders, Warren is surging because she's got ovaries. I mean, wow.
Vanity Fair has been doing a hatchet job on Bernie Sanders. That's one example. One other example was a story that I came across, and I tweeted it out with the question, how is this objective? Because in the piece, the writer, I believe her name is Tina Nguyen, wrote something like, Bernie Sanders is like this old undesirable socialist from Vermont.
Right.
I'm paraphrasing what she said, but not by much. I mean,
Right.
it was such a giant insult, and this was not an op-ed piece. This was supposed to be objective journalism. And that very piece was comparing Warren and Bernie Sanders. I don't understand why that kind of stuff just flies in the field of work that we're in. If you're supposed to be objective, why are you including, your opinion about who Bernie Sanders is or how undesirable he is? It's gross.
Yeah,
But I mean,
it's totally
Vanity
gross.
Fair, I actually liked the reporting that they did previously. And this time around, it's pretty bad.
It's 100, and I think that is also where you're gonna need to start. I think the Warren campaign does need to be held accountable for some of this relative to Sanders, because Sanders consistently, and I know that people got all triggered because there was one tweet where Bernie Sanders put out a tweet, basically saying look, this Politico piece is basically showing the third way is warming up to Warren and so on, which I agree with you is totally dishonest. But for purposes of this campaign, it's true that at the end of the day, the main enemy of all of these forces of corporate and political malfeasance, they hate Bernie Sanders. He's their enemy number one because he offers the most systemic challenge. People freaked out about it, tweeted at him and complained about it. And it's okay, fair enough. I don't agree. I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing to point out. But in general, Sanders goes out of his way, and the campaign's been incredibly civil. I think that if we're going to start being so nitpicky about everything, we have to say hey, maybe the Warren campaign should put out a thanks, Vanity Fair. We appreciate it, but there's no need for this sort of weird, ageist, borderline anti-Semitic editorializing to go along with praising us. You could just praise the senator for her good work. If that's the game we're going to play, then Warren's campaign should be accountable as well.
Yeah, you know what? That's actually a really great point. So I think progressives absolutely should apply pressure, not in a hostile, angry way, because I don't think that you accomplish anything that way, but apply some pressure to have her speak out because, these attacks against him are beyond unfair. And the tweet that got everybody so upset, including Chrissy Teigen, didn't even name Elizabeth Warren. I mean, Elizabeth Warren was not named in his tweet. The reason why he shared that story, that Politico story, was because there were quotes from the VP for Third Way indicating that, anyone but Bernie. So he's essentially saying, cat's out of the bag. They're against me. They're fighting against me specifically, and they're trying to prop other people up, which is, look, these same mistakes were made the first time around. Voters do not want an establishment Democrat, period. So, I mean, the way that this is all going makes it clear to me that these goons would much rather have Trump reelected than have a real progressive in office.
100. When it comes to a group like Third Way, which is, just total mediocrity, corporate laundering nonsense. I mean, 100%. Because as soon as, because their scenario is, yes, best case scenario, you elect a Joe Biden or some other candidate that will, push through legislation for all of the banks and pharma and, whoever else funds these awful places. Or Trump gets elected, and then we get to say, well, the reason was that Democrats didn't propose compassionate debtor prisons, and that's our new initiative. And then, here's our next campaign to make the party more corporate, more reactionary, and worse for people. And, and Sanders is fundamentally antithetical to that. And that's why, frankly, it's and obviously this is different because I think the Sanders campaign understands you need to support independent media and so on. And he's never going to demonize media in the same way but it's you just MSNBC, Vanity Fair, they're not trustworthy sources for covering Bernie Sanders at all. They're not. I mean, frankly,
absolutely.
I mean, look, if you're looking for a fair shake for Beto O'Rourke, then you probably shouldn't watch MR, fair enough. But let's just be transparent about this stuff. The mainstream media, from the weird Politico articles that somehow Bernie Sanders cleaning up his credit score reveals his secret Jewiness, but also how could you be a socialist who wants to have indoor plumbing? I mean, it is bizarre. Right. It's relentless. And all of these outlets are not to be trusted with coverage of Bernie Sanders. I mean, that to me is very clear.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think the progressive wing of the Democratic Party understands that, but I always try to be cognizant of the fact that we're in our bubble.
Right, totally.
And so the important thing is to try to get this message through to the larger Democratic Party. And I'm talking about voters. I'm not talking about, elected officials. I just want them, and it's hard because there's been such a successful campaign to blame Trump's election on Bernie Sanders. So there are Democratic voters, and I'm just guessing, like Chrissy Teigen is probably one of them, who think, yes, if it weren't for Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton would have been elected and we wouldn't be in this mess in the first place. But that's just not true. I mean, so many young voters were like, no, I'm just not going to go to the polls. I have nothing to vote for. And that's really the heart of the issue here. We got to give people something to vote for, not something to vote against, which is Trump. That's not enough to persuade people to go to the polls.
100%. And all the reporting that we have available basically is that even though Bernie Sanders has totally different politics from Hillary Clinton, and there was no love lost between those campaigns for obvious reasons, that he worked his ass off to get her elected president. He was flying across the country and giving good advice that was ignored by their terrible campaign.
Yeah, and I don't know if you saw it, but just yesterday, Bernie Sanders issued a challenge to Third Way because, there's always this pressure for him to unite the party, do what you can to make sure that, we're not attacking one another, unite the party. And so he's saying, all right, so let me ask Third Way, if I get the nomination, are they going to back me? Are they going to defend me? Are they going to fight for me? And of course, I mean, look, we can suspect what the answer is. But I love that he brought that up because he did fight to get Hillary Clinton elected to the detriment of, his own fan base. Like there were people who kind of turned on him as a result of that, but he felt it was the right thing to do. And it sucks because he was in a lose-lose situation. You can't let someone like Trump get elected, but at the same time, the optics of backing Hillary Clinton after, that incredibly tumultuous primary season was difficult for a lot of his voters to stomach.